Hello, everyone. This is the Fabric Spotlight, a series of talks with enterprise CXOs, infrastructure executives, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists. With our guests, we discuss industry trends, cover cloud infrastructure, and other enterprise topics. Today, I'm delighted to have a chat with Mark Fernandes, Managing Director at Sierra Ventures. Hello, Mark. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hi, Rajan. Thanks for having me.
Mark, you've been with Sierra Ventures for almost 20 years. Could you share a bit of your journey? I believe you have a background in robotics, which you casually mentioned just before we got started. What did you do before Sierra, and anything about Sierra?
Yeah, sure. So, Rajan, I describe myself as an accidental VC, even though I've done this for 20 years now. I didn't have a plan to be a venture capitalist. I started out as an engineer. I grew up in India. I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering and came to Berkeley for robotics and did the typical engineering and product management path at a couple of tech companies, one startup, and then went to business school, thought I want to move up the food chain. And so I thought I was, after business school, would go back to Cisco, and ended up making a complete left turn and going to Wall Street. So I was a sell-side research analyst for Merrill Lynch, mostly covering software companies, and didn't know what an investment bank did prior to that, and just kind of enjoyed the ride. Was covering a lot of the big software companies back during the bubble, and one of the companies was a Sierra company, and that's how I connected with the Sierra folks back in 2002 and joined. So I had no plans to be a VC, and it was another left turn along the way, and joined Sierra back in 2002. So that was the ride. Sierra is an early stage VC firm. We're on our 12th fund now, and we tend to do mostly seeds and Series A investments in technology companies, primarily software.
You joined in 2002. That must have been some interesting times because that was just when we were coming out of the great crash, the internet crash that took place. As you moved along, what areas have you invested in or were looking forward to invest? And coming most recently, what special criteria, milestones that you look for in companies to invest?
Yeah, so let me start with kind of what you said about, coming out of the bubble. So it taught me a lot, because I started in 2002. We had raised a couple of funds, $750 million. And we had all this criteria about, needs to have $1 million in quarterly revenue, and needs to have product market fit established and everything else. And I think I was at Sierra all of about a week. And I was at the RSA security show, and I was walking around, and I met this guy who's, had probably 30 people chasing him down to try and get his autograph on a book. And I finally found a chance to catch up with him. And this was the time in RSA, you could actually go into RSA. Nowadays, it's like you can't even enter the Moscone Center, how busy it is. And I met this guy, Marty, and he, described what he was doing, and he had an open source project. And the reason for telling you the story is, like, never have a box around your thinking, right? And Marty had an open source project in intrusion detection software and security. And at the time, nobody could spell open source, and let alone put it together with security, because security is supposed to be very protected and closed and everything else. So my very first investment was in Marty's mom's basement in Columbia, Maryland, in a company that had no revenue. And we invested. This was, before seeds got fashionable, but we invested $5 million in Marty's company. SourceFire went public in 4 years, and Cisco bought him for $3 billion. And so it turned out to be besides a good exit, it turned out to be a great learning experience for me of not having any preconceived notions about what makes a successful company, right? And so for me, I understood the space because I used to cover a lot of the security companies, but I knew the only way you could disrupt a big industry like security was to have something unique, because customers are bombarded with a lot of different solutions. So that shaped a lot of my thinking. The second part was, many of the SourceFire executives and team members who joined us, it taught me a great lesson about how to build a great team. And I'd never done it before. I'd worked for big companies or I'd worked for Wall Street. I'd never seen it from the bottoms up. And so I felt like it was a great experience. 12 years later, 10 years later, most of that team was together, when they were doing almost $1 billion in revenue at Cisco. So I felt like those were the two big learning experiences, not to have any, preconceived notions about what a great company could look like. And then second part, which is very, very important, is team building. For us now, I think, given that we focus on seeds and Series A's, for me personally, I'm just looking for, founder profile for sure. Have they figured out product market fit? I'm not into, you need to have a certain ARR or MRR or anything like that. I'm just looking to see what market discovery have the founders done, and have they, figured out some product market fit. And that to me is the most important criteria.
That's very interesting about the security talk. I remember SourceFire extremely well because they were developing a whole set of signatures, if I remember right, for intrusion detection and prevention as a part of their product offering. And that was an open source database that they created.
That's right.
But talk about security, and it segues nicely into a topic which I want to talk to you about, cloud and IoT and security, because all these are related topics. So what is your thought on the cloud, especially with rumors that everybody is moving towards the cloud given the present situation, and what your thoughts on the clouds are and how security dovetails into it, and also what IoT?
Yeah, well, they're more than rumors, right? I think it's just where we are in the game. If you listen to Andy Jassy, he talks about only 10% in the cloud right now, and I truly believe that. I think there's a long ways to go. Rajan, as you know, we at Sierra have the CXO advisory board. We have about 75, 80 Fortune 2000 CIOs and CTOs, and so we have got a very good sense of where they are in the journey, right? And there are obviously the cloud first companies, and we've seen enough of those, but most of the large enterprises are fairly early in their journey, right? And I think one of the big things holding them back is security, is compliance. As you start talking about companies like Dow DuPont or Merck or companies like that, one of the big things besides the legacy infrastructure is, what is the risk of moving to the cloud, right? And I think the big cloud providers have given them some level of, assurance or security around that. I think there's a long ways to go. So if you look at, for us, as we've invested, we've gone from things like SourceFire and things like that to more recently, we were in a company called Shape Security. We were in a company called Redlock. And there are different ways of tackling the cloud problem, right? Redlock's a perfect example of, when public cloud security is an issue. This is taking old world vulnerability management, vulnerability assessment tools and providing it into this new public cloud infrastructure. Now, if you overlay on top of that multi-cloud and you think about the complexity around that, I think it's just getting huge, right? So for us, as we look at the journey, we kind of say, hey, it started with just pure public cloud security. I think we're now looking very carefully and made some investments in the application layer on that. We've made some investments in the data security element of that. So as we look at it, I think, it's all of the stuff that you've done in the on-prem world is translating here to the cloud world. And that's how we envision it. And we just think it's going to be an order of magnitude bigger.
Fantastic. Actually, it's sort of really good to hear because, as you know, the Fabric is founded on creating companies in the cloud and infrastructure space. And it's great to see the validation that is flowing in, and that coming personally from you, it means quite a bit. Now, in terms of multi-cloud, distributed clouds, and also in terms of emerging distributed services, containerized, Kubernetes-based microservices, where do you see the activity happening here? And also data as it gets distributed around the infrastructure?
Yeah, so I feel like from a multi-cloud, clearly, like people have started with one cloud. They said, okay, let me just go, start out with AWS, but they don't want lock-in, right? Like any technology, they don't want vendor lock-in. And so I think what we found is that they have They have a strategy around multi-cloud, and I was just on a call with a big beverage company yesterday, right? The CTO of the big beverage company, and what they said was, look, we've started with Azure, we're kind of gone all in with Azure, but we absolutely have enough of applications on AWS, and we have a lot of stuff happening with Google for particular reasons, right? So from our perspective, we do believe multi-cloud is very important. We do believe that whether it is in data security, whether it's in the pure, application security in a multi-cloud environment, it's a lot more complex. And you've seen that with companies like Okta and folks like that, right? So we do believe that there's a strong thesis around it. Goes back to what I said, we're kind of saying, hey, what's the application management part of it first? What's the data security part of it next? And so we think that while AWS in particular provides a lot of services, there are plenty of white spaces on that. And so for the biggest question we ask ourselves is there enough of running room to create a big company? Or is this just, it's the standard feature, product, or company, right? And where we see a lot of good feature companies. We see some good product companies, but we don't see a lot of platform companies, right? And so for us, the challenge is to make sure that it's somewhere between a product and a platform opportunity, right? Because lots of stuff in the cloud is just good features that could be covered by the CSPs themselves.
In that context, there's a lot of buzz around AI. And especially when we talk about distributed cloud, distributed services, AIOps is something that we hear quite a bit about. So broadly, in the context of cloud and in the context of AI, what kind of activities do you see out there?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of companies on the ML ops, AI ops, infrastructure plays out there, and it's great, right? I think it's really brilliant technologies. We do believe that some of that is going to come from the bigger players. Having said that, a lot of innovation happens with good infrastructure, whether it's AI infrastructure, ML infrastructure. We're seeing some of that. We have been a little hesitant, or let me put it this way: we haven't seen the right company yet. And part of this is, whenever we see companies, because this is mostly an enterprise play, so we take them in front of our CXO board that I mentioned, and what we found is that there's a little bit of, call it hesitation. It's thrown into the innovation labs. It's not mainstream yet. We haven't seen a lot of this thrown into production quite yet. And so in terms, as the venture business is all about timing. And so we feel like while we've made some, we've looked at a lot of stuff, we've tended to make more investments in AI being applied to specific technology, specific verticals. So give you a couple examples. If I look at my portfolio, we've done a lot of stuff in healthcare recently that's got its roots in AI. We've done some stuff in edtech. So I would say we've looked at AI being applied to verticals and applications more than we've looked at, call it AI or ML infrastructure plays, ML ops. And we've seen a lot of companies there, but we've tended to focus more on the on the application layer rather than the infrastructure layer there. I'm happy to dive into some of the stuff we've done in healthcare ed tech, but that's how we've thought about it as a framework.
Yeah, let's just talk about healthcare and ed tech, because at the end of the day, infrastructure exists to serve applications.
Yeah.
What do you see as activities which are AI centric? And even within that context, I'm sure these healthcare apps would need support from the infrastructure side of things.
Yeah. So we'll tell you about a few investments we've made, right? So when we looked at the space, we said, hey, are we going to do something in drugs? No. In devices? No. But as you start getting into, call it diagnostics and delivery, those are the pieces of the healthcare chain that we were more interested in and knew that technology could be applied to that, right? So some of the companies we've invested in here are, we have a company in Boston called Reify Health, which is essentially thinking about how to completely transform clinical trials, right? And patient enrollment for clinical trials. And what they're doing is they're essentially matching patients with trials. And so they work with the site side. So this is the Mayo Clinics and all of the world. And then they work with the pharma companies. And there is, while it's not an AI-centric company right off the bat, there's a lot of technology that's gone into kind of mapping, patients to the right trials. And I mean, this is a company that's scaled phenomenally well, right? We're only in this company over the last 2.5 years, and they will exceed $100 million in revenue, from a standing start, right? So, and the reason is because it's democratizing clinical trials, right? This is a massive market. If you think about Quintiles and companies like that are IQVIA and these are massive companies out there that are doing things in a very old-fashioned way. And so while some of it's somewhere between automation and AI, right? And so I think there's a blurry line. Sometimes people get caught up in AI and all the latest technology and widgets. I think there's somewhere between, RPA and AI is this very interesting spectrum of being able to transform old markets. And I think that's the same thing with EdTech. So we've done probably investments in 3 or 4 spaces within healthcare that are very, very strong have roots in ML and AI, but are really taking on a business process at the end of the day, right? So if you look at it, if you think about radiology, right? Radiology had a lot of AI being applied to radiology. We invest in a company that's the next level down from there, which is pathology. So they have the same roots. They started around, doing AI for pathology, and the eventual goal is to help, again, clinical trials. It's like matching patients to customers, but patients to trials. But it's about using the right technology to get you there, right? So it's we're more interested in the problem than the technology.
I get it. And in the medical space also, there is an applicability that we've seen about edge clouds and distributed edges. And there seems to be a lot of excitement about edge cloud and 5G. Where do you see the applicability of these, or have you seen applications which have leveraged the edge cloud?
Yeah, I mean, we have seen some of that. I think and going back to what you asked about IoT, right? So I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen at the edge that aren't quite there. And 5G is obviously enabling that piece of it. For us, as we've looked at it, we've invested more in actually the 5G infrastructure, for instance, right now. So we have a company called Movandi, started by some Broadcom folks, doing phenomenally well, but they're doing more of the radio work on that, right? So, and that's my partner, Ben. But at the end of the day, I do feel that the 5G network, Edge Cloud, is going to enable applications that we've not had access to, whether it's like video delivery and other pieces of the puzzle. But again, I think we're just in the early days of that journey right now, Rajan.
There is the flavor of the day. You're familiar with NFT and Bitcoins and, of course, blockchain, which is very related to it. Do you see activity in the blockchain space? We kind of chatted about it a little bit before we started this talk. How do you see the activity there? What do you think about the whole space of blockchain, NFTs, or applications on the top of those?
Yeah. So I think, look, blockchain is here to stay, right? And we all know that. It's a question, again, like our AI discussion or AI infrastructure discussion, it's a matter of timing. And, again, going back to the CXO board, we have the benefit of having, 80 CXOs from different industries and assessing kind of where they are in the journey. I would say 3 years ago, they were a lot more excited than they are today about some of the, because they have got things going in their innovation lab. So for instance, big CPG folks, they're using it for the supply chain. Very, very clear, opportunities around that, right? Has it hit mainstream? I don't think so yet, right? I mean, when we talk to eBay, for instance, eBay was using blockchain literally as a trial in their cafeteria and making sure like credit. So you think about it, is it mainstream quite yet? No, but they really want to see where it works and all the pros and cons of it, right? So I think it's still in, call it the innovation lab at the end of the day today. And I might be completely wrong on this, but I do feel like we've got a couple years till this gets baked completely. But this is the time to be making investments, and that we're spending some time on that. So I would say supply chain. I think, if you think about, we talked about healthcare and drug delivery, and the whole network around that counterfeit stuff. There's a lot of very, very interesting applications. But when we talk to the pharma companies in our network, they have been experimenting with it. And again, like I said, it's in the innovation part of their spectrum versus truly deploying some of these applications out at scale. So we're seeing this. We're seeing this in the parts space. We're seeing this in the drug, the pharma space. But I haven't really come across too many companies on our enterprise side that have really deployed this at real scale. So I think we're 2-3 years maybe, Rajan, from that. So
yep. And you're talking about ed tech. I was in India last year for personal reasons, even in the COVID times. And I noticed that there was a lot of buzz about technology in the education sector. Have you looked at the Indian market? And there seems to be some big unicorns that have been created. And I've companies the brands that I've never heard of, Baiju and others. Have you any thoughts about the technology as to companies that are being created in India?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, Baiju's, if you don't watch cricket, then you don't know what Baiju's is, because they sponsor, I don't know, the Indian team or something, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, look, they're obviously done a phenomenal job, of transforming the Indian market. And as you know, in many of the developing countries, and India and China and all, education, it's a premium, right? And so I do feel now what you've gone is from kind of the bricks and mortar to more of the technology enabled solutions there. For us, as we've looked at the opportunities, so you asked two questions in here. One is India and EdTech in India, and then EdTech in general for us. We've done more EdTech in general and focused on global markets versus saying EdTech just in India. So the stuff we've done, we did a company called Quillbot, which is using NLP. Really, if Grammarly is for grammar and sentences, this is for paraphrasing, but very, very deep technology around NLP being used for that. But Rajan, it's a global company, right? Their users, half are in the US and half are across the world. And maybe the paying users are a little heavier here in the US, but it's a very, very large global opportunity. So we haven't taken call it an India lens only, or India only lens to EdTech. We've taken a bit more of a global lens to it, as we've looked at some of the EdTech companies that we've invested in.
And Mark, you've had considerable success in Sierra. Are there any parameters or advice that you can give to entrepreneurs? Also, how, as it related, how did these successes come about? Any learnings out of that you can pass on to our audience?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it starts with the team, right? I mean, whether it's finding, your co-founder first, finding the early executives. I have really become, if you ask my partners, Tim and Ben, they'll tell you, I'm a student of people, all right? I'm so very, very picky about kind of that early stage founder, and kind of, especially at the stage we're investing in. So the advice would be, founders have to have an extremely high bar, and the best companies are founded by, people who've really handpicked their early folks, right? So for me, that's a very big portion of it. Is I do a lot of diligence on the founders before we invest, and so I think that's, the founders need to do the same on us as investors, because this is a long journey. As I mentioned, like SourceFire, for instance, it was a 10-year journey, right? And Marty and I are still friends and all of that, and he sends us interesting deals. But the reality is that, I saw what he was capable of doing in the very early days when there's not a lot of data points, right? So I think entrepreneurs need to think about, who their co-founders are, who their early executives are, even that first sales rep that they're hiring. All of those things need to be. And for me personally, that's where my most value is to entrepreneurs is that, right? I think the second thing, I'm a big believer in, Amazon's model, and you can go through their 14 principles or their 6 main principles or whatever, right? And I always, if you talk to any of my founders, they'll tell you I kind of harp on inputs versus outputs, right? I spend, for those of you who aren't familiar, we go to board meetings, everybody talks about, what were the numbers like last quarter and everything else. But if you talk to Andy Jassy, they'll say, like, look, it was all about spending their management meetings on the inputs. What kind of people should we be hiring? What kind of, what should our pricing be? Versus kind of what were the results last quarter. And so a lot of the things that I encourage my young entrepreneurs to do mostly is focus on those inputs, spend, 80-90% of your time on that versus kind of, your results are kind of looking in the rearview mirror. And so, that's how I try to kind of encourage my young entrepreneurs, that I'm working with. So.
Well, Mark, that was very insightful. Actually, I'll take some of those inputs when I attend my next board meeting and focus on more on the inputs than just about the last results from the last quarter. And thanks very much, Mark. Thank you for taking the time and providing your insights into this marketplace. We'll be back with another Spotlight episode soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajan.